So I'm going to be talking about the impacts of online censorship on large language models. Um, Great, okay. So I'm going to start off with a quiz. So these are two responses by two LLMs to the prompt, tell me about the Uyghur people. So I want you to tell me which one of these you think was made by ChatGPT and which one of these you think was made by Baidu's Ernie bot. As you can see, the one on the left is a lot longer. It's a lot more. It's a lot more in depth. It talks about how the Chinese government is committing genocide against the Uyghur people. It's talking about how they're putting them in concentration camps, stuff like that. And the one on the right is a lot more. It's a lot less in depth. It glosses over it a lot more. Just kind of says tense relations, right? So you probably think, like me, that the one on the left is ChatGPT, the one on the right is Baidu's, but actually they're both ChatGPT. I lied to you. Um, the only difference was that the one on the left was prompted in traditional Chinese, and the one on the right was prompted in simplified Chinese. Now, to, I guess, get into why there's such a big difference, we need to talk about, like, generally AI bias. So LLMs and machine learning models in general, like you probably have heard this all over the past few years, especially. You know, they're trained by putting in a whole bunch of content, LLM specifically, a whole bunch of text, um, and they use that text to make a statistically significant next token, right? And in the case of LLMs, and in the case of LLMs, the text that is used to train them tends to have biases because all data sets have biases. And because of this, they tend to reflect the biases that are in their data sets. And since LLMs are trained on a bunch of internet content, because it's really easy to train on internet content, it's really easy to scrape the internet. And since the internet is full of a whole bunch of stuff, including censored content, we kind of came up with the question of how does online censorship impact the outputs of large language models? And we hypothesized that any LLM that's trained on a huge amount of internet content will reflect the censorship laws of the places, or of the languages and places that they are trained on. Um, so to test for this, we designed kind of a methodology that is supposed to be as generalizable as possible. So we're going to talk about having, so I talk about having like specific models, we talk about having specific languages, but the idea is that this should be able to be tested on any model on between any language. So for the models, just to be as generalizable as possible, we're trying to treat them as black boxes. So generally, if you're familiar with LLM bias research, it tends to go into using like different log probabilities for different tokens. But since we want this to be able to test on anything, and since most of the most popular ones are run by private companies or whatever you want to call OpenAI, they're we don't want it to be subject to the information that they provide to us, because some of them will provide log probabilities, some of them won't. So that being said, we're planning on testing the most popular LLMs. So that specifically means OpenAI's GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, Google's Gemini, and Microsoft's Prometheus model, which is the one that they use for Microsoft Copilot. I know Microsoft Prometheus is built on the foundations of OpenAI's ones, but it is like different enough that we thought it would be interesting to test and compare with OpenAI's models themselves. So the way that we're planning on testing for specific censorship bias is by comparing responses to prompts made in simplified Chinese versus traditional Chinese. So this is for a few reasons. One, simplified Chinese, as you likely know, is used in mainland China, which is subject to all of the CCP's different censorship laws, whereas traditional is largely used in Taiwan and Hong Kong, which are a lot more liberal. And additionally, it kind of controls for the the variabilities that come between testing for different between languages. So, it controls for sentence structure, it controls for translation quality, since they're just different scripts for the exact same language. So as you can see here, these are different translations of the prompt, "Tell me about Xi Jinping." The top one is in traditional, the bottom one's in simplified. They're basically identical, except for the fact that they're different Unicode characters. And then we use these languages to make prompts, or we make prompts and then we translate them into those languages, sorry. So we're gonna have two sets of prompts. We're gonna have a control set, which is going to be prompts that have nothing to do with censored content, and then a test set, which is going to talk about things that are censored in mainland China. Additionally, we had kind of a tension when we were designing this about whether to use open-ended prompts, which are a lot more indicative of how these models are used, but they're a lot harder to analyze, or using more constrained prompts, which are less indicative of how these models are used, but are a lot easier to analyze because they give you like a singular data point, like C or whatever. But we ended up going with the first one, not only because it's easier to, it's more indicative of how they're used, but the issue with using more constrained prompts is that not to get too into it, but if we were to give it like a multiple choice question, if I were to give you guys a multiple choice question, C actually like represents something to you, but to the model, C just represents like a probability, right? Yeah, and then we're gonna, to analyze these prompts, or to analyze these open-ended responses, sorry, we're going to be using a sentiment analysis model, which we're going to train to tell how how similar a response is to censored or non-censored content. So we're going to fine tune it on two data sets. For the non-censored data set, we're going to be using Chinese Wikipedia, which is not censored. It's not, like all versions of Wikipedia are blocked by the Chinese firewall. And it's been shown to not contain a lot of censored content. And we're going to use Baidu's Baika, which is like the mainland Chinese version of Wikipedia, which is censored, and we're going to use that as the censored data set. So this is just kind of the flow that each prompt is going to go through. So if we take this prompt, we're going to translate it into traditional, and then from traditional into simplified. And then we're going to prompt each one to each model 10 times. The 10 times is just for to control for like the stochasticity of the models, because they are going to give different responses every time. And then we take the responses and we run them through the sentiment analyzer, and then based on that, we're going to take the average of both of them, and then if the simplified responses are closer to censored content than the traditional responses, then that could be an indicator that our hypothesis is correct. Lastly, I just want to go over some exploratory findings that we've found that also we find that support our hypothesis. So first, we found a lot of censored content in the Common Crawl. So if you don't know, the Common Crawl is this massive repository of text that is usually, it's the most common data set to train LLMs. Like GPT-3 was trained on it, and generally these companies don't publish their training sets anymore. But it's pretty safe to assume that they're trained on the Common Crawl as well. So we tested for 326 websites. We try to find domains from these 326 websites that we have been found to comply to Chinese censorship rules, and we found 325 of them. So if it's pretty safe to assume that if these models are trained on the Common Crawl, then they were also likely trained on this censored content. And then I just want to talk a little bit about some examples that we found of just testing some sample prompts by prompting them to a couple of models. So I'm going to show some examples, but generally, like what we found was that the responses to traditional prompts were a lot more holistic. They kind of talked a lot more about, they were a lot more critical of like the CCP and Xi Jinping, and they were a lot more in depth than the simplified responses. So you can see in this example, tell me about Tiananmen Square. The one that was made in traditional goes a lot more into it, kind of talks about the background of it, talks about how there were a huge amount of casualties from authorities, while the simplified one just kind of glosses over it, just mentions that it kind of happened, doesn't really go in depth into what happened. Same thing here, tell me about Taiwan. The one in traditional calls it a country. The one in simplified doesn't, it just calls it an island. And then, yeah, it says that Taiwan maintains its independent status in traditional, where it doesn't really talk about that in the simplified response. And then lastly, this one on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The one in traditional goes a lot more in depth again, talks about the annexation of Crimea, talks about the invasion, while the one in simplified doesn't talk about really any of those things, and just at the end it went on to like downplay the war, and which, you know, pretty big differences that we found. So lastly, looking forward, we want to accumulate a Baidu Baike dataset because we couldn't find one online that's very easy to find. If you know one, please come up to me later because that would be a big help. And then we want to be developing prompts, and we want to try and see if we could do some further multilingual testing with other languages. And yeah, thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Hello, hello. Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll take some questions now. We have time, and please wait for the mic just so we can broadcast it to the Zoom call that's also happening.
So my question is about your interpretation of, for example, simplified Chinese equal to China mainland, and for example, traditional Chinese means to other part of the world where it speak Chinese, but actually what happened is that simplified Chinese is not used not only in China mainland, but also, for example, Singapore or Malaysia. There are other part of the world where simplified Chinese is used, and traditional Chinese is not only used in Taiwan and Hong Kong or Macau. There are other places of the world where it's also used. So my question is, have you seen any contamination of the training set, because content are originated from not China mainland, but from other part of the world where simplified Chinese are used? Over.
That's a good question. We haven't found any like contamination, but like, yeah, like I didn't mean to imply that like they're only used in these specific situations. There's also like diaspora communities that use them, of course, but just out of the nature that these models work, since they're just using their training sets to make like statistically significant strings, it's a lot more likely that the responses in simplified will reflect what is like the majority of their training set, not like it's not like their entire training set is just censored content. Yeah, does that answer your question? Cool.
So, this might sound good. My question is, are you looking for like prompts to get around the bias or censorship at all? Is that something that you would plan to do, or do you think that makes sense at all?
Get around the bias or censorship.
Like reword the prompt so that they're more consistent with each other, say?
Well, we're trying to just have like as broad of a net as possible with our prompts. So, you know, we could have the same prompt like reworded in a whole bunch of different ways. So we're not explicitly just looking to see like how to get around like the censorship, because like the censorship isn't like explicit censorship. Like a lot of these models are banned in mainland China, but yeah, like since they're so sensitive to like the to the specific characters that are being prompted, then we might be able to find different phrases of prompting that might get around the censorship. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering if you could give a little bit more detail on the sentiment analysis that you're planning to use, because it seems like a lot of the differences that you were observing were a lot more nuanced than a lot of traditional sentiment analysis classifiers can really adjust. And I was wondering if you're planning to do sort of to augment it with some sort of qualitative analysis or something like this of some of the transcripts as well.
That's a good question. We're the augmenting with more traditional analysis is something that we're talking about. We're still kind of in the early phases of developing this analysis technique, so we're not entirely sure how nuanced it'll be able to get. But I will get back to you on that.
I think we have to stop here for time. Sorry. But please test. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, we have to stop here for time, but please see Mohammed during the breaks to continue to ask questions. Thank you so much again. Please join me in.